Good evening, all of you. Please allow me to start in a rather personal way. 3 years ago, I went to Iowa in the United States for this international writing program. They bring together writers from all over the world for 10 weeks. Um, Writers are not necessarily the friendliest creatures on earth, but you can actually strike a friendship on a place like this. And so it happened to me with a writer from Sri Lanka, Shehan Karunatilaka. Then, when the program was over, we went home, and I started wondering if I was ever going to meet any of those guys ever again. Um, but maybe a week after I came home, the news came that Chihan was longlisted for the Booker Prize, and I thought, wow. Then a couple of months later, Shihan got shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and that was amazing. And finally, finally, Shihan won the Booker Prize, and that, among other things, meant that he started touring around the world, and it made it, in a sense, easier to finally bring him here. The book that actually won the Booker, The Seven Moons of Mali Almeida, found its way to Bulgaria sooner, translated by Petya Petkova and published by Labyrinth Press. Shehan has also written a novel titled Chinaman, which is immersed into the cricket world. He has written children's books and has worked in advertising. If I have to explain as briefly as possible what's striking about this book, it's the way it explores very dark subject matter, civil war, horrific violence, death, but it's not in the least depressing to read. It works in the grotesque mode, and it's actually filled with black humor. The protagonist, to begin with, is dead from the start. He has to find out who murdered him, and he has to somehow bring a stash of crucially important photos to the attention of the two people he loves. So Shihan, let's start with the Booker and its aftermath, if you don't mind.
Sure.
In those early days, I read an interview with you where you supposedly said writers secretly dreamed of being rock stars. Was that quite serious?
Well, I firstly thank you for inviting me here, and thank you for bringing out the sunshine and bringing me to this wonderful venue. Yeah, I remember the Iowa time. I got a lot of writing done. I don't know about you, but we left. You left with appendicitis. I left with COVID. Right. That was how that trip ended. But a
The
lot of happy.
Iowa effect.
The
Yeah.
Iowa effect. Um, Yeah, this writers are rock stars thing. I was fortunate enough to meet Georgi and had some chats with him, and he will testify. When you are sitting in Colombo or Sofia writing your weird novels, you don't expect it to travel very far. I mean, I didn't expect it to travel beyond India. And then when you suddenly get this news that you're longlisted for this big prize, it's, yeah, you accept that. And 2022, Sri Lanka was going through an absolute economic collapse. There were people on the streets, there was no petrol, there was no eggs, there was no gas. So there was certainly no literature. And I remember at that time thinking, yeah, okay, a short list is pretty good, a long list is pretty good. And then, to my astonishment, I won the damn thing. And as Georgi says, for the next, you win it. And I think I had one glass of wine, and then you're rushed off for interview after interview. They send you a car at 6 a.m., and it's like, okay, here's a coffee, here's a sandwich. Okay, New York Times, 45 minutes, then Guardian, then Wall Street Journal, and so you did. It's quite tricky because these are very friendly journalists, but they're also trying to probe. They're trying to get you to talk about the current Sri Lankan crisis and all of that. So you got to be guarded. I don't know where this rock star quote came from because I'm a bass player and I'm learning drums now. So I like to sit in the background and play my beats. I don't want to be a lead singer and I think, it's weird because all of us writers, we spend our time in dark rooms talking to no one, talking to ghosts, talking to ourselves, talking to imaginary creatures. If it's a good day, I might talk to my wife, I might play with my kids, but most time I don't. And then suddenly you're expected to talk to everyone. And so I don't know what I meant by that quote. I don't think writers seek, I think most writers are bass players, I think. Most writers want to sit in the background and write. But also, we secretly dream. When I was writing my book about cricket, I didn't think anyone would read it outside of India, but you secretly hope that it would reach a. I didn't think I'd be in Bulgaria talking about this. So I don't know if we secretly desire to be rock stars, but I've certainly traveled a lot, and it's been a rock and roll lifestyle for the last 2 years. But I'm hoping after today I can crawl back into the shadows and be a bass player again. But you're grateful. You're grateful for the attention that your silly book has attracted and that it's traveled so far. But it is exhausting. But no, I think I was misquoted. I think it's fake news. But yeah, yeah. Um,
He's a great man, this guy. He's doing a great job. Um,
yes.
Uh, okay, you have traveled a lot, following, so to say, in the footsteps of your book. And I was wondering, because you have also been in touch with very diverse audiences who have read your book, is it read, is it being read in many different ways in different places?
Well, it's strange because I also believe that once the book leaves your the most, I mean, I've only written 2 novels. I'm really slow. 15 years, 2 novels. I need to really speed up. I need to be like Lee Child, write a book a year. But yeah, this one took 7 years. Um, but sorry, I missed the question. What was the question?
How about different audiences around the world and different
Right.
ways in which your book is perceived?
So I think you have that moment when you finished it, and it's a wonderful moment where and we edited this during COVID for 2 years, and came a point in 22, just before Iowa, where I realized, we're just taking out commas, putting them back in, and you have that moment where you realize, I've done the best I can. This is as good as it's going to get. Put it out into the world, and you hope for the best. But you don't expect anything. You think, okay, most books might get a few reviews, might sell a few copies, but you end up going back to your day job. And that's kind of, I moved on to the next book. And I wasn't really thinking how it'll be received and all of that. But yeah, I guess the power of a big prize means it's widely read. And it's strange because it's sold well in places that you wouldn't think have a lot in common with Sri Lanka. It's sold well in Korea, in Greece, in Argentina. And the only thing I can say is what we have in common is that we all live in different dystopias, and maybe what I thought was a very specific story about 1989 Sri Lanka, that dystopia, I guess it has some universal appeal that everyone relates to. Governments that kind of silence dissent, about journalists being silenced, and all of that. Um, in Sri Lanka, for instance, it was well received at the beginning because, as I said, we didn't have any petrol, so we didn't. So no one had read the book. No one had, but once people had read it, generally it was positive. But I think there are always trolls. You should never read the comments, but I always read the comments, and they're always and the trolls. The common trope is. This is how you win awards in the West. You portray our country as a bunch of savages killing each other, and then you go to the West and you present it and you accept your prize. And that was the biggest criticism. But it's straight, like, yeah, again, Goodreads. You should never go to your Goodreads, but I'm sorry, when I'm writing, I procrastinate. I go to my Goodreads, and there are a bunch of 5-star reviews. There are a bunch of 4-star reviews. But of course, you only read the 1-star review, and they're all like, "Oh, what a waste of time this book stuff is." This book, and so I take all of that on board. And look, books aren't for everyone, but I think generally, people seem to have got what I was on about: the fact that there are no good guys in wars, and some dystopias can't be solved, or but even though they can't be solved, that you can linger to hope. So I know, like I say, you let it out, and what people think about is none of your business. Easier said than done. But that's what I've tried to do, and I moved on to the next book. And but for some strange reason, people keep inviting me around the world and put microphones on my head and ask me to talk about it. But yeah, the thing is this: it's not disputed history that I'm writing about. I purposely chose to write about the 80s because I could have written about 2010. I was writing a ghost story where the dead, the victims of Sri Lanka's many conflicts could speak. I could have written about 2010, the end of the war and the civilian casualties, but I'm a coward. What can I say? I didn't want to, because the people are alive, the soldiers are alive, the regime that ended that war is still around, and they're not very partial to criticism. And so, therefore, I thought I can take the same idea and go to 1989. And the reason was everyone's dead. Everyone, the good guys, the bad, well, there are no good guys. The bad guys, the worst guys, they're all dead. And I didn't think anyone could take offense. And I think that hasn't, no one has disputed the facts. I mean, I know this book has talking animals and demons and ghosts and all of that, but the facts of the abductions and the state death squads, that's not disputed. We all acknowledge that those things happen. So I haven't had any controversy that way. But yeah, so far so good.
One reason I'm asking this question is because the book is obviously very much immersed into the social and political realities of Sri Lanka. So a lot of your international readers would start reading the book knowing little about Sri Lanka. Others would maybe pick the book because they want to learn something about Sri Lanka. So I'm wondering if that has influenced the book's reception, but also if even more actually more interesting if that has changed the way you yourself think about what you're doing, and if you feel that maybe people in remote places such as Bulgaria take you as some kind of representative of Sri Lanka.
So now my first book was about a left arm leg spin bowler who played for Sri Lanka in 1985. Now you can't get more specific than that. And when I was writing it, I just thought there are lots of Sri Lankan books about war and conflict and Tamil girl Sinhala boy, star-crossed love affairs, and I just didn't think I had anything to say about the war, anything. And so I thought I'm just going to write a book about cricket because I know I've already lost the audience here, but we won the World Cup in 1996, and this was a major achievement. Yeah, we are water. It's like Bulgaria, yeah, Lechkov with that header expelling the West Germans from 1994. It was bigger than that because we were a war-torn country, impoverished, and yeah, we beat in India, Australia, England, and I thought, okay, forget the war. I'm just going to write about a bunch of drunks watching cricket. And you know, I when you write, you're just. I thought maybe it might travel to India, Pakistan, but then when I sat with, and I've been lucky to have very skilled editors with both books, and what we thought is a good book, you should be able to pick it up without any context and have an experience. And I thought, and that was my goal for myself with the first book. If you know nothing about cricket, you know nothing about Sri Lanka, you should still be able to open the book and have an experience. And it's the same with this. It's a very complex war. It's a forgotten war. I mean, it's not on the world's radar, especially not in the 21st century. But when we edited it during COVID, and if you've read the first few chapters, you know there's like an abbreviation chapter where we summarize, because it was a very complex time. We had three wars happening at the same time. We had an ethnic conflict with the Tamil separatists and the Sri Lankan government that went on for 30 years, ended in 2009. We also had a Marxist insurrection where rural youth were taking on the state in quite violent ways, and then we had the government death squads cracking down quite brutally on them. And then we also had the so-called Indian peacekeeping force, but they came in and they got embroiled in more wars. And during this time, yeah, there were bodies all over the place. I remember I was a teenager at the time going to school and you see burning bodies on the street. And my mom would say, "Don't look, just look ahead." And obviously, I was a nosy kid. I'd say, "Who were these people? Why were they killed?" And no one had any answer. And even though it was a very specific, it was a very complex conflict, I thought it should be able to be picked up in Bulgaria, in Iowa, and it should be able to be understood. So I think when I write the first draft, you're writing for yourself or readers like yourself. But when you edit, you think about that, and I think a good book should be able to be picked up without any context. So I wasn't so worried about that. And I know it's a lot about Sri Lankan politics, but it's just about stuff that we've been discussing at this festival, about memory, about how countries deal with their trauma, and how we deal with our past, and whether you bury the past or whether you dig it up and you scrutinize it. And that's the literal story of Mali Almeida. Mali Almeida, dead war photographer who worked for all these sides. So he worked for the terrorists, for the government, for the foreign arms dealers as a freelance, and so therefore it's a murder mystery. So a lot of people wanted him dead, but in the end, it's a murder mystery and a ghost story. And I think context isn't really that important. I think the fact that people have been able to relate to it around the world means that we all live in different dystopias, or we fear that we're living in a dystopia. And maybe those themes resonate, and it doesn't matter that the specificity doesn't alienate. And that's what we tried to do in the edit, to make sure that even though Sri Lanka is a remote country, hardly there on the world radar, that the story would resonate. And it seems it has, or maybe that's the power of a big prize. But it has traveled far, and it seems to have. I have readers from all over. I have readers from the Midwest of the U.S. asking me specifics about left arm leg spinning and cricketing terms, and that's quite gratifying for me. But yeah, I didn't think about it when I was writing, but it seems to have traveled further than I thought.
Of course, it's also a ghost story, and now you made me curious because you mentioned several drafts. Um, was it a ghost story from the very beginning?
Yeah, so I think of myself mistakenly as a genre writer. I think of myself, I want to write I grew up reading Stephen King and Agatha Christie. I want to write detective stories, and my first book is about two old men tracking down this mythical cricketer. And for some reason, to my astonishment, it got published in England and the US. It won some prizes. And when you write your first, I was working in advertising as a copywriter. I write ads during the day. I wake up in the morning, write my silly cricket book. And then when it met some success, people asked me, what's your next trick? What's your next book? And I had no idea, but I knew that I was sick of writing about sports, because at all my readings, it was just middle-aged men who loved cricket who turned up, and I was a bit tired of this audience. So I thought, okay, I want to write a ghost story, because there were a lot of political stories, a lot of love stories, a lot of thrillers, but not many ghost stories. Now, for some reason, there's a lot of ghost stories coming out of Sri Lanka. I don't know why, but so that's how I started. And I wasn't thinking about writing um, a state of the nation novel or a novel about Sri Lankan history. I thought, okay, what about a story about a ghost who has to solve their own murder, which is not a terribly original a trope. You know, you see it in many comic books and all of that. But when I began the research for it, I thought, okay, where do I set it? And I thought about 2010. So 2010 or 2009, the end of the war. Um, you know, we'd lived with this war for 30 years. You know, I was born in the 70s and I'd grown up with this war, and we thought it was going to go on forever. There was no reason to think it wouldn't. And then when it finally finished, we thought, okay, now the country's going to be unstoppable. You know, the war's ended. We have a beautiful country, so many resources. We're going to now become the next Singapore. That's what every politician says. We're going to be the next Singapore. But 3, 4 years out of it, all that was there was no truth or reconciliation. There was a lot of bickering about the final phase of the war, the civilians who died. The numbers varied, goes from 10,000 to 40,000, but civilians died. And the questions were war crimes committed? Should we talk about this stuff? And in the end, it was a lot of bickering. There was a lot of battle of the documentaries. The kind of the left would put a documentary saying, yeah, there were all these atrocities committed, and it was always, well, it wasn't our fault. It was these guys, terrorists using civilians as human shields. We hear these arguments today. It's an eerie echo of what was happening. And for me and people of my generation, it was a profound disappointment that 3 years after the war, we're still arguing about this stuff. And I just thought, the living clearly don't have a clue about what happened. So let's talk to the dead. And that was I thought I'll start a ghost story where the dead, the victims of Sri Lanka's many conflicts, get to speak. And every ghost, I mean, I don't know how many ghosts there are in this book. There were like 35 ghosts. I think we cut it down. But each one is based on a real unsolved murder. And that's where it began. Well, like I said, I wasn't brave enough to write about those close times. So I went back to 89. And again, I was trying to write a ghost story, a murder mystery. I mean, I think it's a pretty conventional murder mystery, except the corpse is the same as the detective. That's the only weird thing. But otherwise, they're suspects, and it's all those tropes. Um, but, excuse me. But then the ghosts in the book, the original title for this book was Chats with the Dead. Mali Almeida interviewing different ghosts, and the ghosts tended to ramble like I do and philosophize, and that kind of rambling gets mistaken for literature, and then they give you a big prize, and suddenly you're in the literary section, you're not in the ghost section, and that's what happened. But the intention was always to write a ghost story. My next book is going to be a romantic comedy set in an office. That's what I think, but who knows where it's going to end up. But
That's interesting. So you think of yourself as a genre writer, but the book is being read as a literary novel. I actually remember when it used to be the other way around. People were writing literary novels, hoping they could also be read as genre novels. Uh, but
no, I'll tell you one thing. Like, Chats with the Dead was the original title. So, yeah, just before COVID, before Iowa, it was published in India as Chats with the Dead. And it came out in January 2020. So, and then 2 months later, everyone went indoors. And the book, it was reviewed a bit, but it sort of sank without a trace. And one thing, it struggled to find a publisher in the UK and the US, even though my first book had been well received. And everyone said, well, it's difficult, you know, it's a complex, you know, I don't think Western readers are going to relate to um, Sri Lankan politics, Sri Lankan folklore. And I despaired for a while. And then I found a small indie publisher who agreed to take it on. And Natanya Jans, who I owe everything to, I remember she told me, she said, because I sent it to her and I said, look, everyone's rejected this. Should I just write something else? She said, no, I think it's got potential. But the beginning is a bit confusing. The ending doesn't quite work and the middle's boring. But other than that, it's got potential. And we spent 2 years revising that. And she was a wonderful editor and sort of really streamlined it. I remember there was a 30-page scene where bodies were fed to cats, which I really loved because I'm a horror fan. And she said, look, you're not going to win a Western audience by feeding bodies to cats. Let's cut this down to one paragraph. And that's what it ended up. That's good editing, 30 pages into one paragraph. But then when it was done, they told me, Chats with the Dead, it's not going to work. It sounds like a crime novel. And it's going to if it sits in the crime section, it's going to vanish. What about the Seven Moons of Mali Almeida? And I said, that's a horrible title. That's so Orientalist. It's like this enchanted, magical book from the third world. And they go, exactly, exactly. We can sell that. It's going to sit next to Salman Rushdie and Arundhati Roy. You may even get nominated for a prize. Let's do that. And what do I know? These guys are the experts. And that's what they ended up doing. But I was very wary about writing this exotic kind of global south novel, but it turned out okay. Yeah.
um, do you think, because well, the book could be called maybe grotesque, postmodern, magical realist, if we stick to the terms usually applied to literary novels, but anyway, there is this central broadly fantastic elements. And I was thinking of what Ishiguro has been saying a lot, that the fantastic has now pretty much invaded the literary novel, um, the fantastic mode in general. What do you think about that?
This is strange. So now it's being called magic realism. And I don't know, I mean, I know there's some bright people in this room, what the difference between fantasy and magic realism is. I've always struggled. I know it sits in different parts of the bookshop, and maybe that's why I'm an ad guy. I understand marketing, but I don't know. If you have a dragon in your book, it's fantasy. If the dragon is a Leninist Trotskyite, then it's magical realism. Uh, I don't know. I just thought I was writing a very conventional ghost story. But yeah, maybe it's shorthand. It's easy to say, okay, you have a tradition of, yeah, Salman Rushdie and this. But, I was more influenced by the Latin Americans when I was, in the 90s starting to write. I read Bolaño and Garcia Marquez and Borges and Manuel Puig. And strangely enough, even though their societies were vastly, supposedly different from where I was growing up, even Kafka seemed to describe the Sri Lankan experience better than supposed realist writers writing about Sri Lanka. And it wasn't my intention to get into that tradition, but unwittingly, that's where they've lumped me. But I was more influenced by Stephen King, Clive Barker, the Hellraiser series, Paranormal Activity, parts 1, 2, and 3. I, I thought I was writing ghost stories, but yeah, I suppose, yeah, there is magic, there's demons and talking animals, so it goes into magic realism, and also because it's got political elements. But yeah, like I say, this is marketing, and it's best not to think of this stuff when you're writing. I don't think of what genre is this going to fall into. You sort of just follow the voice and where it's going. But I guess this is doomed to be seen as magic realism, even though it wasn't my intention.
You just mentioned a lot of literary influences, writers that you've read and loved. When discussing your book, people have also been mentioning Kurt Vonnegut, George Saunders, Michael Ondaatje, of course, Salman Rushdie. Do you agree?
It's a pretty formidable team to be part of. Yeah, Uncle Kurt has, I can call him Uncle now because I've idolized him for so long. He was always a reference point. So with my first novel, it was about a old man drinking himself to death, obsessing about sport. And to get that voice, I read a lot of Kurt Vonnegut, this kind of old man, drunken uncle tone of voice. And it was conscious because, starting to write in the 90s, we had, South Asian literature was having a moment. And we had some role models. We had Michael Ondaatje, Salman Rushdie, and Ramesh Gunasekara from Sri Lanka. And inevitably, I tried to write beautiful, spare sentences like Ondaatje. I tried to write this real masala language like Salman Rushdie. And of course, I failed. And for me, two characters. One is Kurt Vonnegut. The other is a gentleman called Carl Muller, who is a Sri Lankan writer who used to write a column for the papers. And his first book was published by Penguin. And it was such a buzz for us to see a Sri Lankan writer with the Penguin logo on it. But he's part of the burgher communities. The burgher communities, the descendants of the Dutch, the Portuguese, the British, are many colonizers. And they are the only community in our country that hasn't had a separatist movement, I guess. And then they are stereotyped as being these happy-go-lucky, eating, drinking people. And the Jamfruit Tree, Karl Muller's Burger trilogy, was just about this burger family that got drunk, got into fights, and slept with each other's spouses. But it was written in a very Sri Lankan way. The grammar was all over the place. It sounded like a drunk telling you a story, a drunken uncle telling you a story. And I don't know if you've had the misfortune of having a drunken, and to be honest, I mean, over the last few years, I've had a few drunken aunties telling me stories, and they're as obnoxious. But if you listen to a drunk telling a story, they kind of start here, they go there, and then if you stay there, they eventually come to their point. And I thought, okay, I can't write as elegantly as Ondaatje, as brilliantly as Rushdie, but I can write like a drunken uncle. I can try that. So that was it. And so when I look at the inspiration, even for this one, certainly Kurt Vonnegut, George Saunders, Douglas Adams is another one, Margaret Atwood, writers who are writing pretty depressing, grim. I mean, Douglas Adams, Hitchhikers, it's about humanity's the insignificance in the universe and the meaninglessness of life. Should be a very depressing book, but they're hilarious. And same with Kurt Vonnegut. I've read 8 of his 9 novels, and they're mostly about how humans are just barbarian monkeys who are just destroying the planet and will destroy themselves. And it should be depressing, but it's hilarious. And I really admire the ability to talk about grim things, but to use humor and to be able to kind of balance things out. And so I think, yeah, all those names that you mentioned, is stuff that I aspired to. So I think more Kurt Vonnegut. I mean, George Saunders. That was the other thing. So George Saunders won the Booker for Lincoln in the Bardo, 2017, I think. And this book took 7 years to write. So I was in the middle of writing my Talking Ghost book, and suddenly a Talking Ghost book wins the Booker, and I'm like, oh my god, no one's gonna now. Everyone's gonna think I ripped him off and all that. But then after I cried for a few weeks, I got the book and I read it, and if you've read it, it's a masterpiece. And I thought, and I realized it's a very different book to the thing I was writing. So I thought maybe there's room for two Talking Ghost books in the world, and I was proved correct. But yeah, I think you're definitely right that those are more influences than the Arundhati Roy, Rohit and Mistry. I mean, the Pakistani writers have had a golden age: Mohsin Hamid, Mohammad Hanif, Kamla Shamsi. But I think what's unique about Sri Lankan writing now, or South Asian writing, is we're not afraid to write in our own voice, which was not the case a generation ago. When I was growing up, a lot of Sri Lankan writers attempted to sound like Englishmen who lived 100 years ago. That seemed to be writers of the 70s, 80s. It's almost like we wanted to say, okay, we may be brown third world people, but we can write elegantly like Oscar Wilde, Graham Greene, E.M. Forster. And these books were decent, but they seemed sort of fake. And I think certainly Midnight's Children, Salman Rushdie does not sound like Midnight. He sounds like a posh Englishman, but he took that Masala, Mumbai, Bollywood language and weaved a story from it. And suddenly we realized that we can tell not only out, because South Asia is full of stories. Sri Lanka's an abundance of stories, abundance of absurdity. And maybe that's the through line which I get from Saunders and Vonnegut. Both books are about how absurd life in Sri Lanka is. But I think what liberated us was that we can tell our own stories, but also tell it in our own voice, in our own version of English. And like I said, I've had very skilled editors, but the only thing I pushed back on them is when they tried to correct my grammar. They say, well, it's not quite, the character says, let's put a drink. Put a drink is not correct. You have to say, let's go for a drink. But a Sri Lankan drunken uncle is not going to say, let's go for a drink, my friend. He goes, hey, Machan, let's go and put a drink. And we write that way. And now it's not something to be ashamed of. So I think, yeah, all those influences came into play.
I remember one of those discussions that we had in Iowa, and it was about appropriation, and I'm still very much interested in that. Appropriation, or even writer imperialism, if you wish, because as writers we assume for ourselves the right to speak for somebody else, to represent an identity which is not ours, and for many centuries people seem to be okay with this, but recently they've started wondering how fair it is. What do you think?
Yeah, so that was, yeah, I remember that Iowa discussion. And I think we were on the same panel talking about this, wearing other people's hats. And when I started writing this 2014, 2015, I didn't think twice about Mali Almeida being gay. Um, he was a closeted gay man, a man of many secrets, a man of many secret lives, and that seemed to make sense to the plot. And I just wrote it that way. And of course, I did my research. I talked to closeted gay men from the period. I talked to kids who are on Grinder now. They were kind of useless, but they gave me some insight. But and also, I mean, no spoilers, but his sexuality plays a big part in the plot. Um, but by the time I finished the book in 2020, we had this conversation with my editor. I said, is it appropriate that me, what am I, a cisgender, heteronormative father of two, writes from the point of view of a closeted gay man? Um, and they said, well, I mean, I don't know how I could have redone it because Mali Almeida is a closeted gay man, and that kind of defines the whole story. And in the end, I think our conclusion from that discussion was you should be able to try on different hats because otherwise, I'm just going to write about middle aged Sinhalese Buddhist Sri Lankans who have delusions of being rock stars. And how boring is that? You want to the reason we read, the reason we write is to get into other people's heads, to see the world from someone else's eyes. And the only thing is, if you do it badly, you will get slammed, and you have to take that risk. So I made sure once I'd written it, I got it vetted by my friends who were gay men, and just to make sure that I wasn't being patronizing, that I wasn't being ignorant, and all of that. But I don't think this world is full of I have a Sri Lankan passport, so you got to apply for visas everywhere. There shouldn't be visas on our imagination. You shouldn't be say you're Bulgarian. You should only write about Bulgarian middle-aged men, and that's your. Now I think you should be like I should be able to write about a young Tamil girl in the war. I mean, that's going to be tough, and if I do it, and if I get it wrong, I'll get hammered. But I think we should be able to. So that's in the end the conclusion we came to is that yeah, let's as long as we've done it properly and respectfully and done our research, it's not a problem. I think it's a problem when you haven't done your research and you're resorting to stereotypes and you're being patronizing and you're not being empathetic, then it's a problem. But I think if you do your homework and you write with empathy and with honesty, I think it's all right. So I think we should be able to write about whatever the hell we want to, and yeah, people can criticize that. So yeah, that was a consideration, but in the end, yeah, Mali Almeida is a closet gay man, and look, I haven't played cricket for Sri Lanka, but I was able to write about a guy who played cricket for Sri Lanka. And another thing, I think this is goes back to our conversation in Iowa. One thing that really inspired me as a young writer was to find out that Mario Puzo never met a gangster. He looks like the Godfather, right? You look at a picture of him, he looks like the Godfather. But he was a geek who lived in New York and did social research and might have known a few. No, he didn't actually. He imagined this whole thing, but now it became this folklore that even real gangsters model themselves on his creation. And I thought, okay, wow, if that guy can do that, then why can't I write about a closet gay man who lived in 1989? So yeah, that's my take on the cultural appropriation thing.
Great. I've been looking at the audience, and I can see that they are really interested in what you're saying. So it might be the time now to open the floor for questions from the audience. Hmm.
Не, аз сега ще кажа нещо, може би абсурдно. Обаче, когато четох и така стигнах до средата на книгата, направих един аналогия с Дъглас Адамс и галактическия стопърджия в частта с Господа, който в един момент казал на човечеството да се оправяйте се. Тоест абсурдното в абсурдният елемент в романа. Как има ли го това, което аз го усетих?
The absurd mood. I think so. Apart from this, I've published some children's books and some short stories. By the way, Where Shall I Poop? My second children's book. That's my masterpiece. That's the one that's going to be remembered. But the short stories, I've tried various genres, but I think absurdity is the underlying theme, and I just think that maybe that's the Sri Lankan condition. Like you open the newspapers, it's you can't these days you can't tell, and we have a lot of satirical websites with fake news, jokey news. Now you can't tell the difference between the real newspaper headlines and the jokey ones. And I think the idea that this nation, this war-torn nation, is obsessed with that all men are obsessed with cricket while their country is crumbling. The idea that this paradise got embroiled in three bloody conflicts is, yeah, it's tragic, but it's also kind of pathetic and absurd. And I think maybe that approach has helped me, because if I'd written serious nonfiction or fiction talking about the Sri Lankan tragedies, might have been difficult to write and certainly would have been difficult to read. But I think when I approach it from a position of absurdity and see the kind of black humor in it, maybe that's a way in where you can use that absurdity and humor to look at very dark subjects. So I certainly embrace that, and I think, yeah, I hope all my novels are absurd. As long as the world is absurd, I think, yeah, you've got to tell the truth. Yeah.
Good point.
Yes.
I can see a question over there.
Hi, hello. First, I want to thank you for writing the book because it was devastating. And as someone who loves, breathes right horror, I was intrinsically fascinated with the push and pull between the use of supernatural horror as a way to kind of like make the real horror of the wars and the conflicts feel even more stark in a way that I think that realist fiction is not able to do. So my question for you was like, did you have to think about modulating how far you would go into the supernatural horror and balance it out with the real history? Because the body horror that the ghosts go through is so very detailed and effective. And during the editorial process, did you find yourself having to scale back from that?
Yes, I think I mean, it's a great question. I think there's a quote in the book: don't be afraid of ghosts or demons, because human made horrors are far worse than any ghost story or anything Hollywood can dream up. And it was really true. When I read the case histories of these torture chambers, of these abductions, of these disappearances, um, that was more horrific than a demon flying around with souls trapped in its body. And yeah, I had to, and I think that was a way of kind of a way in for me, um, balance, because the demons in the book, they're all, they're all disgruntled spirits. And what I also found is, if you look at the separatists, the insurgents, it all starts with a worthy cause. It all starts with a justifiable cause. And the Tamil minorities had reason to pick up arms in the 1970s. The disgruntled Sri Lankan youth in the 80s had reasons to take on the state. And they did it with the greatest, the noblest of intentions. But in the end, what happened is these movements became more fascist than the people they were trying to bring down, and committed far more horrors. I mean, in the end, when the Tigers were defeated, I know there was a lot of lamentation, but I think a lot of the Tamil people were also relieved because they had caused more destruction using child soldiers and all of that to their own people. And for me, almost like using the ghosts and the demons was, a safer way to get into it, because the horrors of the real cases were a bit too much to take. And I think also it's it's a safety issue as well, because if you're writing journalism in Sri Lanka, it's dangerous. If you're writing nonfiction about the government, you could be called in for questioning. But when you have a talking leopard and a talking demon, the censors don't know quite what to do with it. And it's no coincidence that China, for instance, has a rich speculative fiction and science fiction tradition, because if you want to make political statements, realistic fiction can be quite dangerous. And so, therefore, using these fantastical elements allow you to kind of camouflage your message there and not fall foul of the authorities. Because um, even during the darkest periods of Sri Lankan history, the theater. Now, Sri Lankan theater is actually, I think, in a much more experimental place than its novels are. And even during the darkest times, we had satire, we had really political plays, but the authorities didn't quite know what to do about them. But if a journalist writes a scathing piece, they go disappearing. So it was a conscious decision to use the supernatural. But like I say, the man-made, the human-made horrors far out trump anything that ghosts or demons can do.
Okay, we have time for two questions, and I believe they're well. Okay, three.
Yeah, in my personal experience as a reader, this was the first book I read, which was written in second person. So I'm really curious, why did you decide to write a book in second person and not in first or third, like most of the books?
Yeah, I tried both of those things. Yeah, I tried writing in the third person. I wrote 300 pages in the third person, and I had to throw it away. And any of the writers in this room know, it takes just as long to write a terrible book as it does to write a good book. And it's demoralizing, but I couldn't make it work for some reason. And I did try the first person. But for me, approaching this, it was a lot of problem solving. Like, I had to figure out, what do ghosts do all day? Because in most ghost stories, you don't find that out. The ghost just turns up and goes boo, and that's it at the end of the book. But in this, the ghost is there at the beginning. And so I had to figure out, what do ghosts do all day? Where can they travel? What does the afterlife look like? And so I had to figure all that out. But the bigger question was, what does a disembodied voice sound like? Because normally with the protagonist, you can describe them in some way. But this, the protagonist is watching his body getting chopped up and thrown into a lake in the first chapter. And I had to grapple with it for a while. And then I came to the conclusion that if anything survives the death of your body, perhaps it's the voice in your head. And I don't know about the voices in your head. I mean, we all have a voice in our head. Some of us have multiple voices in our head. that's okay. But the voice in my head is in the second person. It's in the second person saying, yeah, maybe you should have got more sleep last night. Maybe you should have worn a better shirt. Maybe you should have turned, like, it's like, and the voice in my head, it's in the second person. It's not very complimentary. It's like a coach telling you, you idiot, you should have done this. And so I took that idea and I just started writing. And most of the time we write by instinct. Later we justify it and intellectualize it. But I had 30 pages and then I had 50 pages. It seemed to flow. But it's only later, once I had a couple of drafts in, that I interrogated it. And the idea of what is the voice in your head? And, I grew up as a Buddhist, but I only started meditating 2 years ago once I got an app, a mindfulness app, and I started meditating now. So it took me an app to do that. But when you meditate, that's what mindfulness says. Are you the person that generates your thoughts, or are you the person that listens to your thoughts? And mindfulness says that your thoughts are independent and you should just let them go by like clouds in the sky. And Mali Almeida also has this thought. I think he says, who is this voice that's telling this story? Is it me? Is it my conscience? Is it my soul? Or is there a ghost from antiquity? I'm sure this, if there are ghosts, if Sri Lanka has ghosts, I'm sure Sofia is crawling with ghosts. And is there a ghost behind me whispering bad ideas into my ear? And I've often wondered, I'm sure we've all had moments where we do something or say something and we think, what was I thinking? What was I doing? And sometimes, so this idea that our thoughts are not our own and that there are ghosts hovering around, whispering bad ideas into our ear. At least that was my explanation for why this beautiful country of mine has been embroiled in so many catastrophes. And so that was the reason for the second person voice, and it seemed to work. Also, I have to mention the Choose Your Own Adventure books that I read as a child. And I know that Bulgaria had the game books where it was written in the second person, and you had to turn to page 17 if you want to go through that door. And it was always, you are a spy, you are a cowboy, you are a space traveler. And I think that was my first introduction to genre fiction, because I was quite nervous because I realized there are not many novels written in the second person. Bright Lights, Big City by J. McInerney. Mohsin Hamid's written a couple of novels in the second person, but not too many. But it seemed to work, and I had 300 pages, and I gave it to the editor. I was terrified that she'd say, it's nice, but second person has got to go. And but she didn't say that, and it seemed to work. But that was the reason. The voice in your head. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your fantastic presentation today, and thank you for this great book. I just started reading. I'm in my 60-page, something like this, and I couldn't beat the feeling that I am actually reading a book that is not written now, that it is a book that is written maybe like 30, 40 years back. You mentioned the second person, Butor was what came to me. But what I was wondering first and foremost was about the status of the voice in your book, the viewpoint, the standpoint from which the narration is done. And I was wondering, maybe this like 40, 50 years ago, we were very much into this absurdity and new novel and new novel mode of thinking. And then it was kind of normal to think about the death of the author, all these things. We live today in a very different situation in which we expect somehow to be very aware of the voice of the author behind it. Somehow it's not allowed already to be dead when you're an author. But I have this feeling that you're trying somehow to find a position outside of this book, and that is my question. What is this position? How do you imagine your position with regard to what is going on? And I'll tell you several things which are kind of big concern for me. For example, what is this, the political attitude that you follow? Everybody's a villain in this. From political point of view, all the parties, they're absolute villains, and you obviously ridicule all of them, you make fun of them, but you're also afraid of all of them. I mean, not you, the voice in this book. And it is also with regard to the characters, it seems that there is a kind of coldness that I couldn't recognize in literature today. It's kind of not allowed to be that cold in your books today. And from that point of view, I'm very, very interested. How do you see the position of your narrator in this great book? Thank you.
Yes, I think the voice for me is the most important part of anything. Even when I'm writing an email, I don't write it until I have the proper voice, if I'm polite enough or if I'm firm enough and all of that. And even when I'm writing a short story, you can have a plot, you can have ideas, scenes, characters, but until you have the voice, I don't think the story exists. And with both the novels, the first was, I wrote it in my early 30s. I was writing about a guy in his late 60s who was from a different generation, much more conservative to me, different values. And, I'm a Gen Xer and Mali Almeida's I'm a cynical Gen Xer. This guy's a idealistic boomer. And I think I'm always interested to write voices different from yourself. And I hope you don't see any of me in there because I would like myself to disappear. That's the whole point. I'm a bass player, like I say. I want to sit in the background and all of that. And yeah, when characters start to sound like me, I kind of revise that. So Mali Almeida is nothing like me. Neither is W.G. Karunasena from the first book. And I find that interesting. Otherwise, you're writing autobiography or memoir, and I'm not really interested in that. I don't think it'll be very interesting. And so for me, the narrative voice took me about a year or so to get that Mali Almeida second person narrative voice. And even with the first book, it was a story about a cricketer. I wrote in the third person and all that. But until I realized that this story has to be told by a drunken uncle who may be exaggerating, that's when it liberated me. So I think it's the most important thing of any piece of writing. And I think if you think about the bands that you like, it's the voice. And I don't mean the voice of the singer, it's the voice of how the guitar, it's the timbre of the instruments. That's what attracts you, really. Regardless of the songs or the musicianship, it's some voices speak to you. And I think that's why I'm writing a third novel. Well, I will be as soon as I take the microphone off and go to my shadows. But I've got a plot, I've got ideas. I think it could be a good novel, but I don't have a voice yet. And it's the hardest thing because you can't contrive a voice. You have to wait for it to arrive, and that requires patience. And I think maybe that's what separates writers from civilians, right? So most people write and write badly and decide, okay, maybe I should do something better with my time. But writers write badly and then come back the next day and write again and come back the next day. And then suddenly there's that magical moment, and it could happen 6 months or 6 years after you started, where the book starts speaking to you, where the characters start talking to you, where the voice starts talking to you. And yeah, that's what we sit in darkened rooms for. And yeah, hopefully I can get there with the next book. But yeah, I think narrative voice is the most important thing. And I think in both books I managed to stumble on two narrators very different to myself, but who I was interested in spending time with.
Narrative voice is the most important thing. I couldn't agree more. So, last question.
I will try to be quick. So the book is very realistic, painfully so. And without spoiling it, my question is, uh, do you wish the living characters that never find out certain things about Mali, do you ever were you ever tempted to, after all, let them know what happened? So something is resolved about him in their eyes. Thank you.
Think of the living characters.
Yeah, his loved ones, because they never find out certain things. And were you ever tempted to let them know after all what happened?
But we don't find out what our dead loved ones. They yeah, they don't know what went on. They don't know that, and I think it's just as it should be. Again, with no spoilers, it's a cynical, nihilistic book about a cynical, nihilistic character. But I like to think that it ends on a note of hope. There is, and same with Sri Lanka. We've been through 70 years of trauma and disaster and absurdity, but we always believe that, yeah, this next, same with the cricket team. Our cricket team loses, and then suddenly we win a match, and we think, okay, yeah, we're back. We're going to win another World Cup. And I think that optimism is there. But yeah, the fact that the living never, I think that's as it should be, because that's the whole point. He dies with all these things unresolved, and maybe he comes to some resolution, but yeah, the living have to be ignorant of it. Yeah, I was a bit wary about having the dead talking to the living and all that. I know it features somewhere, but I thought, it's a ghost story. It's got to be a realistic ghost story. And yeah, the fact is, we may get to talk to the dead in our dreams or in our imagination, but mostly they're gone, and it's their journey from then on. So yeah, people have issues with how the book ends, and all my books end, but yeah, I think they're just right.
I would
But,
just like to add, I think the book has a perfect ending. It ended in a right way, in my opinion. Thank you for answering.
thank you.
Thank you, Shehan. Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone. Shehan will be signing books by the bookstore over there. So you're all welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.